Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Emily Chamlee-Wright, Senior Research Scholar at the Mercatus Center and Dean at Washington College. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here.
Emily, today is the 10th anniversary of the Hurricane Katrina disaster in New Orleans. You've been researching the recovery of that city since that time, and I've asked you on the show to give some perspective on the lessons learned. I understand there's actually a field of academic study called disaster economics. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's a broad field, Bill. By looking at disasters, we have an opportunity to understand two things, really. One is, how is it that communities rebound and recover in the wake of catastrophe? And there are many dimensions to how communities come back. One piece of it is political, and what's the legal framework. Another piece of it, of course, is entrepreneurial and economic. Then there's also the socially embedded resources that people mobilize in the wake of disaster, and trying to understand how all these pieces fit together is really the way I look at disaster economics.
Remind us how bad Katrina was. How many people died? How much damage was done to the city? I remember it as being horrible, but, time fades.
Sure. As a consequence of the immediate crisis alone, 1,600 people lost their lives.
Wow.
Property damage estimates across Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Alabama ranged from $125 billion to $156 billion, depending on the estimate. In New Orleans alone, nearly 200,000 homes were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. And along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, another 70,000 homes were destroyed.
Wow. What is the Gulf Coast Recovery Project that you're working on?
The Gulf Coast Recovery Project is an initiative from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and there were really sort of three legs of this project. One team was looking at the political economy dimensions of disaster response and recovery. Another was looking primarily at the financial and economic causes and consequences. And then there was a third leg of this approach that was really looking at the cultural and socioeconomic dimensions of disaster recovery and rebound. And that was really the area where my colleagues and I, my closest colleagues and I, were focusing.
It sounds like a very comprehensive approach.
It is, and it was with a team of, now I think I've lost track, but probably more than a dozen scholars really committing a great deal of effort to these various dimensions of the project. But the piece that I was focusing in on primarily were trying to get our boots on the ground so we could understand what it was that people were experiencing in the wake of Katrina, and what were the solutions and strategies they were developing, because they were there. They understood better than anyone what the challenges were, what the nature of the challenges were, and what the possible solutions were. And so we wanted to capture that systematically and see what we could learn from that process.
Your book, How We Came Back, Voices from Post-Katrina New Orleans, was a fascinating read. I just finished it last night. It's a collection of oral histories with very little of the usual analysis. What's the objective of that approach?
Thanks for asking, because it was an exciting opportunity for us to really put forward fuller narratives of the people who had returned to New Orleans after Katrina. In our social scientific work, that is the background for How We Came Back, how that works is you gather, we had 300 separate full-length, in-depth interviews that included 400 research subjects. And when you're pulling together that kind of qualitative data, what you want to try to do is identify patterns. And it's really the patterns of return and recovery and rebound, for example, in the strategies people deployed. It's those patterns that we're trying to capture in our social scientific research.
Stuff that doesn't necessarily show up in economic statistics.
Yeah, and that's right, too. And what happens in that research is what you do is you grab little snippets of this person from this neighborhood or 10 people from that neighborhood, and they demonstrated this pattern. But you can only really describe a little slice of their experience. And in the book, How We Came Back, we really turned that on its head, and we still did make reference to the social scientific lessons that we had learned over the course of our study, but we wanted to take the opportunity to present the fuller stories of the people with whom we spoke, in part because it's in those fuller stories that you really understand that there is a true arc, that Katrina was part of their lives. It wasn't just their lives,
it didn't
right?
start
They had
there, right.
lives before Katrina. They had to manage in the run up to Katrina. What were the strategies they deployed? There was this time immediately following Katrina that they might have been away from New Orleans for quite an extended period of time. How did they manage that? And how are they managing in the aftermath? And through all of that, they were dealing with the disaster and recovery. Some of them were also dealing with health problems. They were also dealing with marital stress.
All the issues of life.
All the issues of life. And that's what we wanted to show.
I understand that despite its poverty, the hard-hit Lower Ninth Ward had the highest rate of home ownership in all of New Orleans before Katrina hit. You describe it as a porch-sitting community, which reminds me of my parents' stories about sitting on the stoop in the ethnic ghetto they grew up in East Harlem. Describe the culture in the Lower Ninth.
One of the most telling dimensions of when you talk to people about their experience with Katrina is the first question we would always ask is, tell us what life was like before Katrina. And it was that question that often really opened up a flood of expressive remarks about the place itself, a sense of place that was palpable. The most common phrase we heard over and over again was, there's no place like New Orleans. And then from that, you would hear all sorts of things. You would hear, there's no place like New Orleans, and then there would be some thoughts about corrupt politicians, or there would be thoughts about some neighborhoods being dangerous, but it would always loop back to, or very frequently loop back to, a sense of place that the good life could only be found right here in New Orleans. And specifically, more than just the city, a lot of people really tied that sense of the good life, that power of place, to a very specific community. And so in the Ninth Ward, this is one of the most telling dimensions of our research in post-Katrina New Orleans, is in the Ninth Ward study, is among those who had returned, a profound and pronounced sense of place was one of the critical drivers of why people returned.
So despite the dysfunction, the fabric of the village life there in the Ninth Ward seemed incredibly strong.
One of the things that we ask people to describe a typical day or a typical weekend, and oftentimes what you would hear is stories of going to church, a social after going to church, extended family getting together. The Sunday was the one day a week when everybody got together. And one of the metaphors that I think emerges is that New Orleans is maternal in so many ways. When you think about the traditional
it's matriarchy
ideas of the matriarchy, it's the provider of food, it's the provider of home.
Unconditional love.
Unconditional love, absolutely. And so the sort of crucible of home and family and that sense of hospitality, that really is the quality and character that you glean from talking to people from New Orleans who are very, very tied to their neighborhoods.
And that's what they came back to try to recreate.
That's exactly right.
FEMA got especially bad marks for its performance during the disaster, but did New Orleans suffer from a lack of federal money through the recovery?
Well, there was a lot of money going into New Orleans and Louisiana and the Gulf Coast generally. There certainly was a lot of largesse. But one of the things that you need to remember, though, is that there is a layering of contractors and subcontractors and sub-subcontractors, so that much of the largesse gets gobbled up through a sort of political economy process.
Consumed.
Before it reaches the average citizen or the average survivor.
I saw some statistics that perhaps $1 billion got dissipated in fraud.
I don't know the source of that, but it wouldn't surprise me given the magnitude of the resources involved.
How did city, state, and federal government agencies perform through the tragedy and its aftermath?
As you know, in the aftermath of Katrina, one of the biggest criticisms was the lack of response from FEMA, the slow response in terms of recovery assistance programs and the like, and all of those have been well documented. I think one of the things that's important, though, is to recognize that this is not just a matter of people being lazy or corrupt, though, of course, you can point to examples of that. Really, as a political economist, what I'm interested in is understanding the more systemic reasons why these systems that are set up to help people oftentimes in the end don't end up helping people.
From the stories you told in the book, there seemed to be a lot of overlapping and conflicting instructions that froze people in place rather than let them start with the recovery.
Yeah, and one of the lessons that we've gleaned from this research is that public policy, if it's aimed at really tapping the capacity for recovery that is within communities, that's a good public policy. So, for example, this sounds like a really simple thing, but a municipal response, if you can get in and remove very large debris, and in the context of post-Katrina recovery, it could be, huge trees to large boats and things like that were in the middle of roadways, and not to mention vehicles. If you can clear that out and people can get to their property who are ready and able to assist themselves in the recovery, that's a huge benefit to people who are really ready to be the first movers back to a post-disaster environment.
So basically just get stuff out of the way. Don't tell people what to do.
Getting stuff out of the way, doing the things that we're used to local and state governments doing, like providing police protection, for example, making sure that as quickly as possible the lights get turned back on, the electricity gets back on, so people can use those power tools that they have ready and waiting for them to start to orchestrate a recovery.
So, Emily, I had a chance to tour the Ninth Ward that next spring after Hurricane Katrina. After seeing the physical devastation, I would have bet you the whole thing would have just been plowed under. Why did so many people come back?
It goes back in part to what you were talking about earlier, Bill, which is that high rate of home ownership. The homes that people were returning to oftentimes had been in the family for many generations. That was their principal asset. That was going to be their legacy that they would pass on to their own children. Their sense of home and their sense of place, again, was very fiercely tied to the neighborhood itself. And so that commitment is a big part of it.
But the recovery only works if enough of them come back. You can't recreate community by yourself.
That's exactly right as well. And that's what economists call the collective action problem. That one person might want to come back, but unless they know for sure that everybody else is going to come back or enough people are going to come back, it doesn't work because then the stores aren't going to be there, the laundromat won't open, the health clinic that you rely on isn't going to be there.
Yeah, the church won't be there.
The church may not be there. So those are the things that you need to feel sure are going to come back as well before you can commit to coming back. And so that's one of the real vexing problems of a post-disaster situation that the Ninth Ward in particular was facing.
If you can recall, share a notable story with us from an individual.
Well, sticking with the Ninth Ward, one of my favorite couples that we interviewed, Irvin and Elizabeth, who are featured in How We Came Back, a retired couple, very able-bodied. They were of advanced age, but you wouldn't know it from watching them move around. And the first thing they did is they gutted their own house and they started to repair and restore and remediate the property and restore the property. Turns out that Elizabeth had the drywall hung wrong. She had to completely take it out and redo it again. This sense of, we're just going to get in here and do it. This was one of the most powerful stories to me. But again, you need to ask the question, why? They had a modest pension. They did have some options to go elsewhere. Why did they come back? And you hear them talk about how they love New Orleans because of the Mardi Gras balls that they would be a part of, that he was part of the Knights of Columbus. He was part of the social fabric of the community. They had family in St. Bernard's Parish that was just down the road, and that they would travel back and forth every single weekend to have an outdoor social of some kind or another. And this is the kind of connection, these little threads of connection that brought them back.
Emily, if you just sort of take in all the stories and try to synthesize some major themes, what emerges?
Our broader project was to understand better the sources of community resilience and recovery. And there's some obvious things that you want to look at. You want to look at what income levels are within neighborhoods, for example. You want to look at who had flood insurance and all of that. And what's important is that after you account for all of that, there was still a lot of variation about the neighborhoods that came back quickly and the neighborhoods that had more trouble. And we really wanted to understand two things. One was, what impact was the policy environment having on people's strategies for recovery? And so that was one line of research that we conducted. Another was, what are the socially embedded resources that people draw upon if they don't have flood insurance, if they don't have a lot of resources in the bank? What are those other resources that they can rely on? And it was the resources embedded within neighborhoods, as you mentioned, the churches, for example, the resources of family and friendship networks. These were the things that we wanted to capture systematically and understand better how people were tapping those resources to leverage a recovery and comeback.
The churches loom very large in these stories, but it's a distributed community. It's not a centralized church community.
Some were. Looking at the Ninth Ward is a good example, that many times the parishioners who would come to a church may live in a completely different place in New Orleans, and the people right around the church would not necessarily be parishioners in that church. So that was the case in some neighborhoods. In other neighborhoods, like the Mary Queen of Vietnam community in New Orleans East, on the other hand, that neighborhood was very much focused around, geographically as well as socially, around the Catholic Church within that community.
You know, you mentioned the Mary Queen of Vietnam community. I understand that's the largest Vietnamese community in the world outside of Vietnam. They did very well. To what do you attribute their success and recovery?
One of the things that is really important in that story goes back to a sense of place. For this community, that New Orleans neighborhood was like a second homeland. And those aren't my words, that's their
words. It was
words.
a second homeland. I mean, they beat it out of there with their lives. So it was a chance to start over in America.
It was a chance to start over. And one of the things that is important about this particular community is that they could trace back their history to North Vietnam, 3 different villages within North Vietnam, that when they were displaced to South Vietnam, they came together as a community there. And then when they were displaced again to New Orleans, they came together consciously and deliberately because they knew that that was going to be the source of resilience.
Strength. Sure.
But an important lever for that community post-Katrina was that story. So if you were the pastor, for example, you would tell that story from the pulpit. You would tell that story on Vietnamese language radio. You would tell that story in casual conversation because it was a template for resilience and recovery. That template translated the hardship of Katrina into a kind of familiar context. You know, it's different, but we've been through this before.
And we could do it again.
Was the frequent refrain.
Right. Emily, picking up on that note, let's take a somewhat counterintuitive perspective on all this destruction in terms of an opportunity to create a fresh start. Some wags have opined that washing away the dysfunctional New Orleans public school system may have been the best thing that ever happened to the city. Is there any truth in that?
I certainly think that there was. It certainly cast a very bright light on many of the problems that existed in the school system pre-Katrina. It is true that when we talk to people in Houston who were New Orleans evacuees and who stayed in Houston and were still there 3 years after the storm, the data broke down about half and half. About half of those respondents were just really desperate to get back to New Orleans, but there was something that stood in their way, perhaps a sick relative, for example, who just needed to be near hospital. There was another group, though, that did say, the other half really said that getting out of New Orleans was good for them, that it allowed them a fresh start. And the schools were a big factor in some of those stories where people were saying, I've got my kids enrolled in this school system now, it's much better. And so for that reason, I don't want to go back. So I think that we do have to recognize that there are some lessons to be learned from that experience.
Well, charter schools seem to have played a very large role in the recovery there.
Yes, that's been an important drawback for many people, especially people who are of a kind of in a demographic where they are at the productive years in terms of their life cycle. They have young children. They want to move back to New Orleans, but the only way they really feel they can move back is if there is a school that they can bring their kids to. So schools and safety are the key drivers of decision-making for a lot of the people within that demographic.
In the time we have left, what are the key takeaways from your studies?
The key takeaways that we really want to emphasize is that the power of place is critically important in recovery process, and there is tremendous capacity within communities to orchestrate that recovery. But policymakers need to do what they can to support them. That may sound obvious, but the best ways of supporting people who have capacity to return early is oftentimes, as we were discussing earlier, really just getting the basics in place, getting the roads clear, getting the debris removed, getting the lights back on, because that's the thing that allows those early returnees to come back.
Right. Just turn the social entrepreneurs loose once you've got the basics done.
And I keep emphasizing that early return, because it doesn't mean that everybody's going to flood back right away. Frankly, you don't want everybody to come back right away, because some people need a lot of help, right? A lot of assistance, a lot of services. But to the extent that those early pioneers, whether they're residents or local businesses or even a big box store, to the extent that you can get those folks back in quickly, what they do is they send a very, very early but powerful signal that life is returning in the community. If you can send that signal effectively that normal life is going to return because your neighbors are already starting to return, because the Walmart is back up and available, because the church is back up and running, those early returnees send that signal to people who have to wait on the sidelines for a variety of reasons, but they're paying attention to what's going on back in their home neighborhood. And if they don't see any signs of life, they're going to start to reorient their life elsewhere. But if they do see those signs of life, they start to orient and orchestrate their own return. And that's critical. But a lot of our public policy, unfortunately, ends up, often unintentionally, keeping people from returning early on, even when they would be capable of doing so.
You know, in a way, it's no different than other forms of entrepreneurship in our economy.
That's exactly right. In this case, it's a kind of social entrepreneurship.
Emily, thanks so much for sharing your insight with us. We appreciate you coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure, Bill. Thank you for having me.
That was Emily Chamlee-Wright from the Mercatus Center here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. If you'd like to help us expand, please stop by realclearradio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.